All right. So I started back in September 2015. So I'm also like Åsa, just in the final stage of writing up my dissertation, editing the final text. I have my defense now coming up in January. So I'm in the middle of basically frenetically like trying to make it work as a whole, as a product. So before coming here today, I was deliberating a little bit about how to structure the presentation, and I decided that rather than trying to recap my entire dissertation in 20 minutes or so, I will instead introduce you a little bit more generally to the research topic that I have been addressing, which in my case has to do with the question concerning the nature of technology as it figures in the geoscientific discourse. So I have been interested in, one might say, in how the essence of technology, that is to say, what technology is, has been negotiated within the earth sciences. Particularly then, have I been interested in how this has happened in the wake of this late 20th century concern for what is called the anthropogenic dimension of global environmental change, that is to say, humans impacting basically the biosphere, but also other geospheres. So basically the idea is that man is powerful or technologically powerful enough to alter the very structure of the entire Earth. So in other words, I've been trying to ask, how is the whatness of technology, what technology is, depicted in the geoscientific discourse today? And what is its genealogy? So I've been interested in trying to trace it back in history to say, how are we looking at technology today? And where has this come from historically? How have we ended up with this particular understanding of technology? But also, why have we ended up with this particular understanding of technology? I think is interesting to ask. And in order to demonstrate what I mean, I want to shortly take us back a little bit historically, or quite far back actually, all the way back to Aristotle. But I won't take us in this 2,000-year excursion. But I think nevertheless, when it comes to asking the question about the nature of technology, it's necessary to start with Aristotle at least, so we know what we are in conversation with, at least in the West. Because when it comes to the entire history of metaphysics, it is most often Aristotle who is considered to have inaugurated the ontology of the artifact, that is to say, what a technology is and what distinguishes it from other kinds of beings, or what distinguishes the artificial from the natural. And from Aristotle onwards, technology has conventionally been understood as essentially inert and neutral, as a tool whose status, Aristotle means, is entirely determined by the use to which it is put by man. So it is a tool, and it has an intention external to the artifact itself. That is to say, there is someone who is steering it. And for Aristotle, this is of course the human. So the intention, when we put a tool to use, the intention rests outside of the tool itself. It rests in man. Man is using the tool to accomplish a certain end or a certain goal. And Aristotle puts this in opposition to natural products or organisms, which he claims they have an internal principle, that is to say, they are guided intentionally from within. This is not the tool. So, for example, an organism grows by itself, it reproduces itself, it is guided by, it is organized internally, it's self-organized, Aristotle says. And that is what distinguishes nature, natural products, from artificial products. So the artificial has to have an intention that comes from the outside, that sort of starts up the machine, that tells or designs the machine for a specific purpose, which the machine itself has not decided. But that is then in distinction to the organism. The organism decides itself. It has an autonomy, which the tool does not have, on how it goes about in the world. And I think such is the understanding of the essence of technology that has dominated Western metaphysics ever since Aristotle. That is to say, technology is a prosthesis to either nature or reason or man. So it's a supplement to all these things. Technology is a supplement that is used by either man or a supplement to sort of better nature, while the organism is constitutive in itself. The organism is self-directed. So that's the difference that we have. That's, I think, where the idea in the Western tradition of technology as something separate from nature comes from. But in modernity, on the other hand, I think we are presented with an increasing number of transgressions of the Aristotelian boundary between nature and artifice. And we are doing so both on a microscopic as well as a macroscopic scale. And in my own work, I've been interested in the macroscopic end of the spectrum, where we seem to be faced with what I think can be called sort of a globalization of technology. That is to say, humans now, in this day and age, move more rock and soil than all of the Earth's glaciers and rivers combined. We fix more nitrogen than all microbial activity on the Earth. And moreover, we consume and transform such vast quantities of resources so as to alter, as I said, the entire structure of the Earth's geospheres. So technology has come to take on a quite different aspect, maybe one might say. For example, in the late 1980s, the environmentalist Bill McKibben argued that in the wake of the transformation of global ecosystems due to many different phenomena, but he mentions, for example, large-scale environmental pollution and massive recreational use of nature and the environment. The concept of nature as, now I quote McKibben, as a, quote, separate and wild province, the world apart from man to which he adapted and under whose rules he was born and died, has itself perished. And this is something that McKibben means characterizes modernity and the relation between nature and technology and modernity. So such an increase in magnitude of human alteration raises the question concerning the point at which natural objects become technological objects, or more generally, the extent at which nature turns into artifice. And the issue here might be one of degree, right? Like at a certain point, it seems that a natural object turns into a technological object. But, McKibben points out, it also has qualitative consequences. For as he writes, and I quote again, this new rupture with nature is different not only in scope, but also in kind from salmon tins in an English stream. We have changed the atmosphere, and thus we are changing the weather. By changing the weather, we make every spot on Earth man-made and artificial. We have deprived nature of its independence, and that is fatal to its meaning. Nature's independence is its meaning. Without it, there is nothing but us. So, in one sense then, technical artifice, originally distinct from natural products, now appear increasingly indistinguishable from nature. But in another sense, as issues of environmental change suggests, I think this naturalization of technology may not be particularly helpful when it is precisely the question of the technical alteration of nature that we are facing today. We're facing in an age of global environmental change. In an age when, as McKibben also points out, we're facing a situation when man all of a sudden has the technological power to alter her environment, which might lead to a number of difficult and very dangerous consequences. For instance, the widespread adoption of the term Anthropocene during the last 20 years indicates, I think, the wide acceptance even far beyond the geoscientific community, of the view that environmental anthropogenic impact has become such a powerful driving force for global environmental change that the destructive legacy of the human species will now be recorded in geological history, or what is otherwise called deep time. So, in short, the idea of a sublime nature has been replaced by that of a technological environment. Humans, it is argued, has transformed the planet at nearly every scale we are capable of measuring, such that the very distinction between nature and artifice has lost its meaning. So I'm interested in this shift, one might say. What happens to the entire Western canon once technology becomes so ubiquitous that it can be said to have become a global planetary phenomenon, to the point that it not only sort of permeates nature throughout, but thereby also expands beyond the control of man. And in both cases, I think it loses this instrumental value that Aristotle described technology as having. That is to say, technology becomes more and more a sort of environment that we live within, rather than a tool that we use to alter nature. Similarly, proponents of the Anthropocene in the geoscientific community, although they have conceded to the fact that there are prevailing disagreements on even the most basic methodological questions that concerns the Anthropocene as a formal unit of geologic time. So the Anthropocene was posited first as sort of a formal unit of geological time. The end of the Holocene marks the beginning of a new age, supposedly. I'm not sure if this has actually been accepted or not. I think not so far. But it signals this idea, right, that in the Holocene, man was still using technology sort of as a tool, but in this new age, the Anthropocene, technology has become environmental instead. But these proponents of the Anthropocene have instead argued that despite these methodological disagreements, that to assign a more specific date to the onset of the Anthropocene seems somewhat arbitrary. Because rather, the point is, they argue, that the conceptual power of the Anthropocene does not fall exclusively within the ontic realm of factual thinghood, but it is rather the power of the Anthropocene resides in the way it challenges this ontological distinction between natural and human history. So as the geographers Simon Lewis and Mark Maslin have stressed, what is at stake in the formal definition of the Anthropocene is not limited to the status of an empirical fact. That is to say, it's not only of interest to geoscientists at this point, but equally, it concerns ontological questions about the nature of technology and of man. As they write more broadly, the formal definition of the Anthropocene makes scientists arbiters to an extent of the human-environment relationship, itself an act with consequences beyond geology. I think this is where the humanities and the geosciences intersect, so to speak. This is where I enter with my own research interests. Or in the philosopher Clive Hamilton's words, the appearance of this new object, the Earth system, has ontological meaning. It invites us to think about the Earth in a new way, an Earth in which it is possible for mankind to participate directly in its evolution by influencing the constantly changing processes that constitute it. It therefore brings out the conception of a joint human Earth history. That is to say, these two aspects have now all of a sudden become entangled, the human and the Earth. It's not that we on the one hand have human history and then natural history, but when we historically interest us for something, we must always study them in interaction. So, what on earth is this so-called Earth system then that Clive Hamilton speaks about? And even more importantly, what are its implications for our understanding of technology? Well, I think we have to make a little detour here, and I hope it still makes sense. the Earth system, according to the historian Amy Dahan, which marks a contemporary conception of the Earth as an organic whole, can be traced back to research in the 1980s, which began to embrace certain ideas of non-linearity and so-called complexity. In particular, the view that man and nature are inseparable, and the consequent integration, therefore, of physical with chemical, biological, and technological processes. That is to say, when we study the Earth, we cannot just study the physical, geophysical processes in isolation, and then sort of like add, like a black box, add the chemical processes, and then add the biological processes, and then add the technological processes. But rather, the idea is that these are always already interacting with each other. So the technological processes have very severe consequences for the working, the functioning of the physical processes. So complexity theorists usually speak of an organic conception in terms of that the greater is the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. That is to say, it's impossible if we want a all-inclusive picture of the Earth, if we want the best understanding possible of how the Earth functions, we must always study these processes in interaction, which means that in some sense these technological processes have always interacted with our understanding of what nature is. But the Earth system scientists claim, well, this is sort of an idea that we came to now in the late 20th century. The picture that I put on the slide is perhaps considered one of the most, I think, iconic representations of the Earth system. It's the so-called Bretherton diagram, which was published in a 1988 NASA report led by the meteorologist Francis Bretherton, and which historians of science have pointed out as the sort of inauguration of the birth of Earth system science, which has a certain normative content to it, because it depicts how geoscientists from now on ought to study the Earth, how they methodologically should approach the Earth and conceptualize the planet. That is to say, as this dynamic interaction between nature and artifice, which rejects the traditional Aristotelian view that these are separate. Sure, they're in interaction, but they're separate. But this sort of is a rejection of that view, which says that, well, nature have always been, in a sense, technological, just like then technology then also was always natural, right? We tended to think once upon a time that, well, technology was somehow ontologically distinct from nature, but this is the view that they want to contest. So technology should not be taken as an external variable when it comes to processes of change that we're studying in the Earth, but it should be understood as always already internal to how the Earth itself functions. Technology is very central for what we consider to be natural. For example, I think Lynn Margulis, the biologist, takes this example of how the atmosphere once came about on the Earth, and that this was sort of a technical manipulation by bacteria, cyanobacteria, to give rise to oxygen in the first place. So oxygen was not just, we just don't have a stable background or a static nature in which all this exists. But nature in itself always has to be created or reproduced so that it exists as nature, as a habitat for us to live in. So the technological is always already present in nature. So in other words, these Earth system scientists puts it this way: to understand nature properly, we must understand technology as an expression of nature's self-organizing capacity. And right, that was Aristotle's idea of what characterizes nature. nature is self-organizing. Technology is not. Oh, sorry. Yeah, okay. And this, I think, here we begin to see how Aristotle has been stood upon its head, so to speak. They say we have turned Aristotle upside down with this modern break. And I think this modern break then consists in an ontological slippage of the capacity to self-organize. So, in other words, the very distinction between nature and artifice, which Aristotle located in the capacity to self-organize, has been challenged. Now technology itself is merely one of the systems which do self-organize. Technology is extremely central to the earth, so central that it cannot be said to not have this similar capacity to self-organize. And this is very much evident in the current geoscientific discourse on the Anthropocene. And I've just taken an example here, the geophysicist Peter Haff, who draws upon this idea of a dynamic interaction between geospheres as an expression of the Earth's self-organization, and has proposed that the spatial manifestations of the Anthropocene consists in the emergence of a new geosphere, what he calls the Technosphere. And in his paper, Humans and Technology in the Anthropocene, Haff writes here, and now I will quote again, "The technosphere is a system for which humans are essential, but nonetheless subordinate parts. As shorthand, we can say that the technosphere is autonomous." And see, here he introduces this autonomy that before this modern break, only the organism possessed. And this does not mean that humans cannot influence its behavior, but that the technosphere will tend to resist the attempt to compromise its function. It is a global system whose operation underpins the Anthropocene and therefore merits special attention in our attempts to understand the role of humans in a nascent geological epoch. So putting all these observations together, Haff arrives at an understanding of technology where technology looks rather organic than mechanistic. So if technology for Aristotle was mechanistic and that sort of distinguished technology from nature, now all of a sudden it seems like we are possessed by an understanding or a mode of disclosure what technology is, in which technology appears as more and more organic instead. So rather than conceptualizing technology as an instance of the biological, that is to say, as a tool that the biological organism can use, according to Haff, we should switch the picture altogether. So we should detach the organic from the biological realm to introduce it to also the artificial realm, or the technical realm. So, in other words, instead of sort of, I think the scientific reductionist attitude has been to reduce the organism to sort of a mechanical view of the world. And it has been recurrently critiqued for doing so, right? Like everything can be reduced in the end to just efficient causes, like billiard balls crashing into each other. And this somehow it doesn't give due to our autonomy as human beings to actually be morally and politically responsible for our actions. But here I think we're also faced with a different attitude from this scientific reductionist one, which is its complete inversion. That is to say, everything is reduced to the organic instead. So it's not just nature and humans now that are organic, but it's also technology, even the artificial. For instance, as stated by the British geologist Jan Salesiewicz, the Anthropocene represents a new phase in the history of both humankind and the Earth, where natural forces and human forces became intertwined, so that the fate of one determines the fate of the other. And just to conclude, I think it is in this manner that the technological spreads and extends across the globe, all the way to the point as it culminates in the power of geophysical force, it loses its properties as artificial, and with the loss of these properties, that which would allow it to be distinguished from nature in the first place. So insofar as the Anthropocene discourse has upturned the classical idea of natural systems perturbed by man's activities into its opposite, that of artificial systems sustaining an essentially technical biosphere. And this is not to argue that we, in the Anthropocene, never encounter nature in itself, since our experience of nature is always sort of technologically mediated. But I think precisely to the contrary, this is to claim that human artifice in the Anthropocene is understood as always already natural. That is to say, man's production is constitutive of nature as such. Technology is natural. Nature in itself, in fact, is seen as nothing but creative production. It is precisely by the means of artificially altering her environment that man is understood to be acting in accordance with her human nature. This is what man does naturally. And it would be wrong sort of to say that, no, we should not do it. This is not what I'm arguing for. This is sort of, I think, one of the very prevalent views today in the geoscientific discourse of what technology is. So keeping this in mind, what I've sought to do in my dissertation is to examine what the philosopher Michel Foucault calls the conditions of possibility for our current understanding of technology. Which is to say, what is presupposed such that technology appears to us, paradoxically enough, as thoroughly natural. Because there seems to be a curious paradox here, which I think is a big problem. That although the Anthropocene stresses the potential danger that resides in the power of technological alteration of nature, it also seems to mark the point at which this Aristotelian boundary between artifice and nature is broken down altogether. In other words, the discursive framework of the geosciences today, in the form of the Anthropocene, disperses technologies to such a degree that it appears no longer to be relevant or even possible to ask what technology is. What is it that distinguishes technology? Because it is so dispersed into the natural. We sort of have lost this distinction. So I'm interested, just like technology for Aristotle was essentially instrumental, a tool in opposition to the organism, in opposition to nature. I'm interested in our current understanding of technology rather as constitutive of nature, as the most sort of basic natural thing there is almost. And I'm interested in where does this come from? What is the sort of intellectual historical provenance of this idea? And it is this history that I, in my dissertation, examine and try to stake out. Right, and this is just sort of, I think, two reasons for why it's crucial to raise the question concerning technology today, to raise the question of its essence. But I'm sure I'm already running over time, so I want to thank you very much for your attention.